Hello, and thanks for joining us here on Encore. Coming up on today's show. A military operation that cast a shadow over the beginning of the 21st century and ushered in an age of Islamic insurgency. The 2003 invasion of Iraq played out on our television screens at the time, and it's re-emerging in film, theatre and literature. Brian Van Reet's debut novel, Spoils, is now part of that canon, taking a headlong look at the collateral damage of the modern war machine. He joins us here in the studio to tell us more. Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me here.
Well, your latest book, Spoils, has been translated into French under the title Le Fer et le Feu, or Iron and Fire. Now, that book delves into quite personal experience. It's about the invasion of Iraq in 2003, something you participated in as a soldier. The book's made up of 3 different points of view, and 2 of those viewpoints are young people serving in the US military. How autobiographical were those accounts?
Well, there are many details and experiences in those accounts that are taken from my experience, especially in the young man character, Sleed. He did the same job that I did in the Army as a tank crewman, and so a lot of those details are taken from life. In other ways, these characters are for sure fictionalized. They're not me. They're not exactly like me, and some of them are quite different from me, and on a surface level and in their you might say their spiritual essence is different from mine. So it's a blend of my own experience and research and imagination too.
And the details seem to ring true. Now, the third character is a foreign mujahideen fighter. He's fighting from what's meant to be an ideological position. And now, given the religious and the cultural distance from your own experience, were you hesitant about writing that character?
At a certain point, attempting to write this book, I felt like that needed to be one of the points of view, to get a good, comprehensive understanding of the war, why it happened, what forces were at play. Yeah, it was daunting to write that character, and I felt a certain amount of responsibility to get the details right, to try to learn, something about that experience. It's not something you can just kind of dash off on a lark. So I felt the weight of that, and also with Cassandra Wighard, the young woman soldier, the same thing. I'm very cognizant that that's not quite my experience, so I have a duty to try to get it right and to be respectful in a sense in writing it.
Now, to go back to your own experience, I read that when you left university and signed up for the Army at 20 years old, interrupting your studies, I think, you said it wasn't a political act. So what were the reasons behind it?
Well, I was a fairly reckless 20-year-old young man, which is already a reckless class of human being. So it was sort of an impulsive, emotional decision for me more than some kind of thought-out political thing or a career path. I don't know if that explains it, but it wasn't something I put enough thought into.
But it was in 2001, wasn't it?
Yeah, I signed the enlistment contract in November of 2001, so it was just a couple months after 9/11. It was weird because I'd never really thought of joining the Army in peacetime, and then when a war broke out, I started thinking about it more, and I keep coming back to the word reckless, and I think a lot of young people join the Army for similar reasons. Some people grow up knowing they want to be a soldier from the time they are small children, but some people are more like me where they sort of stumble into it in a way.
Okay. Now, there's an episode in the book where some of the soldiers enter a property which once belonged to Saddam Hussein, and they're pretty stunned by what they find. We know that did happen in Iraq. Was that a first-hand account for you? Did you do that?
I was deployed in 2004, so I saw some of those palaces that I'm writing about, the Saddam's palaces, but by the time I saw them, they had been sort of converted into offices for high-ranking Americans. Any looting had been done by then. So I imagined what it must have been like in 2003 when Americans first encountered those palaces, but I didn't do any looting myself. But it's again a blend of things that I saw and things that I imagined and researched. And there were certainly Americans who got in trouble for stealing things from those palaces, cash and gold, artifacts, things like that.
Indeed. Now, you mentioned Cassandra Wiggard, one of the soldiers who is a woman. They were very much outnumbered on the front at that time. And without revealing too much about the book, I can say that she does suffer a certain amount because of her gender. At a time of the Me Too movement in other prominent industries, do you think sexual harassment and abuse, even in the military, is being addressed today?
It is being addressed, but I don't know if it's being addressed sufficiently. Especially, when I was in the military 13 years ago, it wasn't something that was talked about very much, and it was prevalent. Cassandra there are multiple conflicts in the book, and there's the shooting war, and there's also this gendered conflict where she's under the threat of sexual violence from men, and that includes, men on all sides. It's a conflict that doesn't know boundaries of nationality or ideology. And I felt like it was important to put that conflict in the book as part of war and part of her war.
Mm-hmm. Now, Spoils is set in spring 2003, a time when the world was still reeling from 9/11. As you mentioned, the US government was deploying their military response at the time. We asked former US Ambassador Jeffrey Hawkins about the feeling at the time and its consequences for American society.
Here was a conflict that was portrayed in very simple terms, and we went in, we thought we were going to replace Saddam Hussein, that the Iraqi people were going to rise up. There were those famous CNN images of the statue of Saddam Hussein being toppled by the people of Iraq, and it quickly became clear that in a multi-ethnic country that had been tamped down by a dictator like Saddam Hussein, with Kurds and Sunnis and Shias and Yazdis and all the rest, it would be very complicated to find success. Everything, whether it's literature, art, migration, politics, Donald Trump, it all sort of ties in a bit, at least, to the period that Van Reet's talking about.
Now, Brian, do you agree with that last comment, that politically today there's a line that links us directly back to what went on in Iraq?
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I think it's one of the most consequential events around the world of the last 20 years, and a terrible blunder in U.S. foreign policy and we're still seeing the results of that play out.
And as a writer, in terms of literary, artistic output, how do you see the difference between what we call a pre-9/11 American society and a post-9/11 world?
In terms of the literary output, in certain ways, Americans have engaged more with subjects like this. There have been a number of excellent books on the war, both nonfiction and fiction. So Americans are engaging with it to an extent, but at the same time, we're kind of isolated there on our continent, and the best-selling books aren't really about war events. They're things like 50 Shades of Grey. So there's a large disconnect in American society between kind of like solipsism or not engaging with the world, and many people who are ready to engage with the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, we see that on all sides of this conflict, from the insurgents to members of the US military, at one point, people's faith in the cause starts to dwindle somewhat. There's a little bit of cynicism. Do you think that today, as the war has shifted to other fronts, do you think that the battle for hearts and minds has been largely lost?
Sadly, I would have to say yes, at least for generations that are living now. There's a whole generation of Iraqi children who's grown up knowing nothing but war, and that will be with us for many, many decades to come. And so I'm very skeptical of further U.S. military involvement in the region. I think other than, humanitarian assistance, I'm skeptical of that. And I worry about the consequences of that.
And if there's a positive message that your book could perhaps push forward, what would that be?
I think it's the message is that the world is complex, and we should pause and try to understand it and try to empathize with other people before judging them.
Well, finally, we asked you for a cultural tip to recommend us something that you've seen. You flagged up the documentary Lioness, which focuses on women in the military. What's the most important thing that you think the film reveals?
I think one thing this film does really well is it humanizes soldiers and women soldiers, and it shows you they are people with families and lives, and they come from a diverse set of backgrounds, and that they're really human beings. They're not some idealized version of a soldier.
And did you see it as an authentic document, as someone who's...
Yes, very much so, yeah.
Okay. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll leave you with a clip of Lioness, directed by Mag McLaughlin and Darius Summers. The novel Spoils is available in English and now in French under the title Le Fer et le Feu. Do remember you can get more arts and culture on our website, and you can keep up with Encore on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
I think a lot of the general public probably has no sense at all of the kinds of things women like the Lionesses are doing.
They needed a Lioness team so badly, and so many, that even as a support officer, I was pulled in.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, the Lionesses did what had to be done.
I felt like the Gestapo.
I was running with that Marine firing team, and there's insurgents all around me firing at me.
Women are technically forbidden from participating in combat.
Well, defining what is a combat job today is not so easy.